Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now, how was that for an icebreaker? A word about how that came about. Jesse and Rob and Zach thought they were going to surprise me by having the Emerald Society pipe band come down from New York. But as you know, I'm very proficient at, dare I say the word, spying. And I discovered the plot, and so this was my counter surprise. The last time I played was just December 8th. Now, that was my youngest daughter's wedding here in Washington. And some of you may remember that I was announced by the president on December 7th, and Pearl Harbor Day. The way that came about was the announcement was supposed to be the following week, but on the morning of December 7th, I got this call from the president saying, Bill, I know we talked about doing it next week, and I know your daughter's getting married tomorrow, and that's fine if you want to keep it like that, but I'm just going out to the helicopters, and I'd like to announce it if it's okay with you, but it's totally up to you. And I said, no, Mr. President, we had discussed it as a family, and if whatever you consider best is fine with us, we'll adapt. So sure enough, it was my first out-of-body experience, and there'd been a lot since then, but I turned on the TV, and there he was announcing me as Attorney General. Now, that was great, but the following day at my daughter's wedding, my daughter said to me, she says, Pop, you're the only guy I know who would upstage his own daughter at her wedding. So when I was toasting, I said, Meg, I said, look at it this way. Just before the name Barr is dragged through the mud, you're changing your name to McGaughey. Anyway. Well, good morning, everybody, and I'd like to thank Rob Herr and Zach Terwilliger for bringing this conference together, and especially thank Jesse Liu and John Huber, Jim Kroll for their leadership of the AGAC and the EOUSA, and of course, Tim Garrison for his wonderful rendition of our national anthem. And I really want to thank New York City's Police Emerald Society Pipe Band. And I want to thank all of you. As I told you when I came on board, I firmly believe that there's no finer complement of U.S. attorneys that's ever been assembled at the department. And the intervening months have only strengthened my conviction. I've met most of you individually and have seen the great results of all your work, both in individual cases and in the aggregate. And it's a real privilege for me to serve with you, and I look forward to working closely with you in the months ahead. Much has changed here at Maine Justice since the last U.S. Attorneys Conference. You have this old Attorney General as your new Attorney General, and the department has also welcomed recently a new Deputy Attorney General, Jeff Rosen, and those of you who have already worked with him know that he's a superlative lawyer with broad experience in senior levels of government and in the private sector. And he's already making and will continue to make a great contribution to the department. We also have new leadership in the Associate's Office, where Claire Murray is now serving as Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General. But while much has changed at the department over the past year, a lot has also stayed the same. As I told you months ago, I support the prosecutorial priorities of Attorney General Sessions. We remain focused on violent crime, drugs, immigration, and national security. And there are also a number of specific initiatives that he established, which I hope to continue and build upon. And as I said at my very first day when I talked to you all, it's full speed ahead is the order of the day. Now, over the last several months, I've been struck by the contradiction that you no doubt experience every day. On the one hand, the department's law enforcement efforts are at their all-time best. We have dedicated agents and AUSAs working tirelessly to enforce federal law across the country. and you and your teams are exhausting all available resources to maximize our impact on the communities that we serve. On the other hand, the threats we face are greater and more complex than ever, and we still see persistent violent crime, growing national security threats, record threats from illegal drug distribution, and the increasing reach of transnational criminal organizations, and a crisis on our southern border, all despite the department's record-breaking efforts. Now, much of what we're doing today, in my mind, is trying to make up ground that we lost as a result of inattention in the past. And I assure you that with sustained efforts and firm resolve, we will make up this ground and surmount these challenges. I want you to know that I support you and your teams and will do all I can to help you step up the fight. One of these priorities has been fresh on my mind of late, and that is violent crime. We were all alarmed by the events in Dallas, Texas, where a disturbed veteran opened fire at the federal courthouse, including shooting at 3 AUSAs and one of their children. We're fortunate that the would-be shooter was the only casualty. And I am proud of the response of the courthouse security and of the FBI and of our U.S. Attorney's Office under the leadership of Erin Neely Cox. The personal safety of our AUSAs is of the utmost importance to me, as I know it is to all of you. And I have been closely focused on proposals by the AGAC to ensure the safety of our prosecutors. I assure you that the AUSAs will have the authority and the tools they need not only to do their jobs effectively, but also to keep themselves and their families safe. Now, today we're the lucky ones. Far too often I find myself writing condolence letters to the families of fallen law enforcement officers. And just in the past week, we have seen 5 officers killed in the line of duty, 4 of them shot by armed criminals. Police officers selflessly put their lives on the line to keep all of us safe, and attacks on them are an attack on all of us. These and other incidents are connected to the emerging willingness in some quarters of our society to countenance resistance to and violence against law enforcement officers. This department will not tolerate violence against police, and we will do all we can to protect the safety of our law enforcement officers. We can all be rightly proud of this administration's record on violent crime. We have made impressive progress, but we must keep up a full court press. There are still areas of the country where we have not made sufficient headway. For many communities in America, armed criminals and violent crime are still the norm, and we cannot accept this as the status quo. That is why the department remains committed to driving down violent crime, including through the vigorous prosecution of firearms offenses. I've been glad to see that the prosecutions under 922G are at an all-time high. We need to maintain our focus on getting illegal guns off the streets and out of the hands of violent criminals. I want all of our offices to work with their state and local partners on trigger lock cases that take advantage of stiff federal penalties to punish and deter violent felons. I also want to see vigorous enforcement of the background check process, both against prohibited persons who lie and try and against firearm dealers who skirt the process. We need to provide real deterrence. I look forward to working with all of you to step up our drive against gun crimes. As you all know, we also cannot reduce violent crime without confronting the role of gangs and other criminal organizations. Working with our state and local partners, we must keep sustained pressure on these groups, which are the primary drivers of violent crime. Many of these criminal organizations are national or transnational, and thus require a coordinated federal strategy. We are already working with the AGAC and our national task force leaders on strategies for the top transnational threats. But whatever the scale, The department needs to use all available tools to dismantle these groups and to disrupt their efforts. RICO is one powerful tool to neutralize violent criminal organizations, and I know that some of you have used it very effectively. We should strive to duplicate these efforts across the country. While I am talking about violent crime, I also want to make clear that while our focus is often on predatory violence, I am also deeply concerned about the rise in hate crimes that we have seen over the past decade. We must have zero tolerance for violence that is motivated by hatred for our fellow citizens, whether on the basis of their racial, religious, or sexual characteristics. We also need to take a strong stand against those who would use violence to intimidate people from exercising their rights to free speech and to participate in the democratic process. In addition to gang and guns, the other significant driver of violent crime is obviously drug crime, which represents another priority for our department. When I returned to the department as Attorney General, it was disheartening to learn about the state of the drug problem across the country. In most respects, the problem is much worse than it was in 1993. I believe that the last administration was not aggressive enough in fighting the drug threat. A lot of ground was lost, and a tsunami was allowed to build up, which is now hitting the country. But we can't be discouraged. When I look at the overdose deaths, the blighted lives, and the families and communities broken by drug addiction, it reminds me why we cannot surrender. We must work harder than ever. I am proud that the administration has shown much needed light on the opioid epidemic and that the department has taken a number of dramatic steps to tackle this national crisis head on. And while there are encouraging signs of progress, our work is far from over, as you all know. On the streets, the rise of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids have been followed by 100 times stronger carfentanil and mixtures of fentanyl with cocaine and other drugs. We must continue our efforts to prevent and punish diversion of illicit drugs, another area where we have made great strides. And as you know, while opioids are the most acute problem in many areas of the country, in other areas, Mexican methamphetamine is surging. We must keep fighting and keep innovating to match this ever-evolving threat. We also face an unprecedented immigration crisis on our southern border. The Department of Homeland Security is in the lead in tackling this problem. A lasting solution will require changing our laws, but in the meanwhile, we must do all we can to support DHS. And we have to continue our work prosecuting the illegal entry cases and reentry cases that DHS refers to us. But even if we devoted every AUSA in the country to those cases, we could not resolve this crisis on our southern border through prosecutions alone. That is why I'm working to address the problem through a surge of immigration judges, new attorney general rulings, revised regulations in coordination with DHS, and a host of other measures. Most dramatically, the president has achieved a real breakthrough in our relations with Mexico, whereby the Mexican government is now taking a series of critical measures to control the flow of illegal migration. Just these initial steps are starting to bite. There is a real prospect that these actions, along with the efforts in Central America that we are taking, will help us turn the corner. National security must always be a top priority. The department is fully committed to combating terrorism, foreign intelligence threats, and the theft of intellectual property by foreign adversaries, and cyber attacks. These efforts lie at the core of our sworn oath to defend the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. First, over the last decade, we have achieved extraordinary successes in combating terrorism and terrorist threats at home and abroad, but we can never let our guard down. We must use all available lawful means to neutralize terrorists in the United States or elsewhere where we find them within our reach. The United States relies on many tools to combat international terrorism, and the work of the U.S. Attorney's Office has been a critical part of that effort. In appropriate cases, we will continue to prosecute terrorists as one important means to protect our citizens by removing these deadly threats from the face of the map. Second, among the greatest threats to our national security are those posed by rival foreign powers. Foremost among these is China, which we know to have both a robust intelligence operation and an economic strategy that includes exploiting the intellectual property of our companies and our citizens. We need to continue to pursue and indeed step up our China initiative. The threat of attack on our economic infrastructure, trade secrets, and intellectual property is ever growing, and we should be prepared to address it wherever we find it. Finally, and relatedly, we remain focused on the growing and evolving cyber threat. In the 21st century, increasing proportion of crime is cybercrime, as the dark web has become a black market for contraband that fuels criminal endeavors of all kinds. As organized crime becomes increasingly transnational, we see more and more crime move online. We have resources to address the cyber threats, but we must ensure that we use these resources efficiently to operate in an environment that grows increasingly vast and challenging. As I alluded to earlier, there are also a number of other focused initiatives that I hope to see continue and strengthen during my tenure. For me, the Elder Fraud Initiative provides a great example for how the department can use its resources with a high return. Not only is the elderly population among the most vulnerable of our citizens, but we are learning more and more about the role of foreign and transnational criminal organizations in perpetrating these schemes. Another area I want to see us redouble our efforts is in prosecuting human trafficking violations, especially those involving children. And we're working with the AGAC and several components on initiatives to step up the fight in this arena. That should give you a sense of my views on our priorities. But my charge today is not to go out into the field and maximize prosecutions in each of these categories. You will always need to strike a balance, and as you do, here are a few things to keep in mind. First, in a department like ours, the notion of priorities should not be confused. We have an obligation to enforce all federal law, and that means covering all the bases as best we can. If we say that the department will prioritize violent crime prosecutions, we know that this cannot mean that we ignore civil rights violations or environmental crimes. We must try our best to enforce federal law across the board with the limited resources we have. A necessary corollary is that federal prosecutors must exercise sound discretion to strike a balance. This balance requires that each of you adapt the department's general priorities to the specific circumstances of your districts. Thus, while opioids represents the greatest drug threat in many districts, others face greater problems with methamphetamine or cocaine. And while transnational criminal organizations may be the primary driver of violent crime in one city, in another area it may be a localized or homegrown groups. Our department priorities have never been intended to take your eyes off the leading problems in your districts, including the great work done by your civil divisions. Each of us, and each of you, is responsible for determining where we can have the biggest impact in advancing the safety and well-being of your communities. And once we've decided where to dedicate our resources, we must do so efficiently. Tenacity is often a great attribute, but you must also be prepared to redirect efforts when prudence so dictates. We must remain thoughtful and objective in our analysis of the merits of an investigation and be nimble enough to reassess as circumstances change. Knowing when to drive on and when to redirect your limited resources is a critical part of leadership. Third, we must take ownership and accept accountability for our decisions. Every indictment that comes out of your office bears your name, and as you know, is your responsibility. It also ultimately reflects on your colleagues in the U.S. attorney community and all of us who work at the Department of Justice. And that is a grave responsibility, but an essential one, because the legitimacy of our system ultimately depends on this accountability, from the AUSA on the line all the way up to the Attorney General. So with that, I'd like to close my remarks. Thank you all for the superb job you're doing, and repeat that I look forward to working closely with you in the months ahead. God bless.